Well, hello! It's time for part 2 of my series on the Democratic presidential candidates and which ones are good or bad, or, what kind of decisions you need to make before you decide to back somebody or just kind of get yourself an idea about what's going on. Because a lot of politics, especially when it comes to electoral politics, is a lot of window dressing, a lot of vague platitudes, but not a lot of hard brass tacks. So I'm trying to look over the candidates to see what they actually have done with their careers, where they're coming from, and what kind of policies they put forward. This one's probably going to be longer than usual because Bernie Sanders, unlike a lot of the presidential candidates, actually has policies written down instead of a lot of vague value statements. Of course, I also have to say, for the sake of transparency, I have been a really big fan of Bernie Sanders for almost 10 years now. You can see in the back there, I not only have the Bernie Sanders action figure, but I helped kickstart it. And I have several other things. So let's just say I'm trying my best, but I am coming from a biased perspective. So I'm just going to preempt all of the based comments. I know. I'm trying my best. So Bernie Sanders, the surprise dark horse candidate of the 2016 election, is trying again to become president in 2020. I think everyone was expecting it pretty much ever since he dropped out of the primaries in the last time. And on top of that, when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump, we knew that we should really give this Sanders idea another shake. So let's start with where Bernie Sanders comes from. He was born in 1941 in Brooklyn. He is the son of Polish and Russian immigrants, Jewish, Polish, and Russian immigrants, and a lot of his family died in the Holocaust. And this is really important because Sanders took to an interest in politics from a very early age, notably with discussions about how an election, like electing Hitler, led to the death of 6 million of his people. So, yeah. In the 60s, as a student, he was a member of the Socialist Party. He was an activist in the civil rights movement, even to the point where he paid fines, got arrested, and even went to the March on Washington in 1963. So he's a witness to social justice history, and he cut his teeth in a real professional activist organization. In the 70s, he was an anti-war protester, like you do in the 70s. And in the 1980s, he became the mayor of Burlington, a city in the green state of Vermont. I actually went to university very close to Vermont, and I had several friends and roommates who were actually from Vermont. And when he was more local in his politics, like when he was a member of Congress and when he was mayor, he would actually host these spaghetti dinners, which I thought was kind of cool, very much a man of the people type situation. And in the 80s, when most baby boomers gave up on trying to make the world a better place and focused more on making more money for themselves, he became a mayor of Burlington, but on top of that, a vocal critic of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, which, if you watch my video on Operation Condor or know anything about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America in the 1980s, they were funding right-wing death squads in order to suppress social democratic movements within the entire continent. This is actually the moment where I think Bernie Sanders was better. He hosted a talk by Noam Chomsky and called him one of the most important intellectuals in America at the time. And also on top of that, he led a very successful downtown revitalization project in Burlington, which to this day, because of this action, is one of the most livable cities in America. Because, socialism doesn't work, except for all the times that it does. In 1987, his horrible socialist policies led to him being considered one of the top 100 best mayors in America. So a lot of people in Burlington and Vermont and America in general, if they are familiar with it, are pretty happy with Bernie Sanders' run as mayor of Burlington. This is when he had a public access show, and I believe at one point he recorded a folk album. The hippie socialist roots of Bernie Sanders, his bona fides on that front are top-notch.
I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me.
His next step in his political career was to go and run for the House of Representatives. Vermont, being a very small state, only has one, so he was the House of Representatives representative. Now, Bernie in Congress was definitely not invited to sit at anybody's lunch counter. He was an independent back then as well as today, and so in his efforts, in his positions, specifically railing against how both parties were in the pocket of the wealthy, see how consistent he is, he made enemies on both the Democratic and Republican sides of the aisle. He was ahead of his time, and now the Democratic Party is just starting to catch up. Not in the organization, but in the voter base. And the 90s were a troubling time if you were a left-wing Democrat. This was when Bill Clinton was president for the most part. Bill Clinton is probably the most right-wing Democrat that's been put forward since, like, I don't know, Polk? Just gonna check if that joke makes sense. Is Polk a Democrat? Yes, he was. In the context of that, he co-founded the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is a left wing of the right-wing Democratic Party at the time. So it was the leftovers of the progressives that were left in that. And today, the Progressive Caucus is a reasonably large cohort, a group focused around certain issues within Congress. So it's still a powerful institution that Bernie had a role in setting up. And in 1999, when Clinton and Congress were all on board to repeal Glass-Steagall, Bernie was against it, which, went against both Republicans and Democrats. You detecting a pattern here yet? Hello, voiceover editing Tristan here. I forgot to explain what Glass-Steagall was in the video, so I guess I'll just do that a little bit now. It was a law put in by FDR during the Great Depression, which was an attempt to prevent Second Great Depression. The idea behind it would be that banks that invest in stocks and invest in companies and things like that take those kind of risks and gambles could not also be banks that hold people's personal finances. So basically it was a ban on banking companies gambling on the stock market with your money. And yeah, the neoliberal Democrats decided to end that practice. And let's just say the Republicans were fans of that idea too. And everybody wonders why the financial crash happened. And of course, he was a critic of Alan Greenspan, the chair of the Federal Reserve, who basically had a meltdown and renounced a lot of his ways after the financial crisis. So Bernie was ahead of the gun on that. Now, one of the things that the Clinton campaign in the 2016 election tried to call Bernie Sanders out on is his lukewarm to approach to gun control laws. Bernie, of course, is the representative from a very rural state. Their relationship with guns is very different. And so he voted for several things, some things that he says he'd take back today, but, let's just, cover it for the sake of fairness. In 1993, he voted against the Brady Bill, which would have put in place a mandated federal background check and, of course, impose a waiting period for people trying to get new weapons. But he did vote for an act in 1994, which did put in some gun control laws. And also, he said because he wanted to support the Violence Against Women Act. And, of course, there was a ban on some assault weapons, which Bernie was for. In 2005, he voted for a bill which would alleviate gun manufacturers of responsibility or for negligence if one of their products had been used in a crime. Although in 2016, Sanders has said that he's taken this back. So he has evolved on this somewhat. So like the call out that he was given on his gun control record was because he had like a D- from the NRA instead of an F. I also will say this is a problematic thing. In 1996, he voted for an act which would get rid of prohibitions from the police to buy tanks and armored personnel carriers, which I think is not good, especially with the militarization of the police going on. I hope if someone ever brings this up that he'll say that it was a mistake. And during the War on Terror, he was what you would expect. He was against passing the Patriot Act, and every single time the Patriot Act has been up for revote or up for amendments, he has always voted to reduce it and not to renew it. And he also was a vote against the war in Iraq. And in 2005, he voted against an act which would exempt the internet from campaign finance laws. So he's always been very consistent on campaign finance as well. So we're going to get to everything and talk about all the issues a little bit later, but I'm just trying to shoot through his political history because he's done a lot. So after his run in Congress, he decided to run for senator of Vermont. And as senator, his job had to change quite a bit. Bernie Sanders, as senator, is one of the less productive senators in the US Senate, at least if you look by like straight amount of like signatures onto bills have passed. He's very much been a protest vote in a lot of things, but he has had a lot of success in ways that a lot of people don't see as necessarily a sign of a productive senator, but I would argue they are. For example, he has gotten parts of his agenda pushed through by attaching small amendments to larger bills. When you're an independent who the Democrats don't play nice with, you're very limited in what you can actually do while you're there, and so even this is a legislative victory at least. He had issues when Citizens United passed. He was for breaking up the big banks in the wake of the financial crisis. He tried to push to bring back the Glass-Steagall Act. All these things that the Obama White House just wasn't having any of. He's also had a lot of financial reforms he's wanted to do, but the Democrats have always pushed back on. He wants to reform the Federal Reserve, and he wants to use the US Post Office as a place to have some basic financial services for people in kind of economically distressed areas. And he's done a lot of stuff that's very pro-worker. I'm sure that surprises you not at all. He's the big proponent for the $15 minimum wage. He's a big proponent for making it easy for employees to unionize. And he also is a big proponent for something called the Bezos Act, which was directly to target at Amazon. So basically when you're paying your employees so low, you have to pay extra money if your employees are so underpaid that they have to be on things like Medicaid and food stamps, so that they can't just like make those kind of costs of the basic things that their employees need an externality. But I think the thing that I want to mention about his Senate career that was when I found out about him was that in 2010, when George Bush's tax cuts were set to expire, the Democrats and the Republicans were on board for extending them so that they would keep going. This was something that was putting the US in a whole lot of debt, and it was basically a massive tax cut for rich people. Bernie Sanders, a very lonely voice in Congress at the time against keeping these tax cuts, did an 8.5-hour-long filibuster trying to stop it. It was not successful, but it did get him way more of a national stage vision. This was when he ended up on the news. This is when I found out that he existed. This was in the end of 2010. And this was when there was a vision of an actual left wing in US politics, which is something that we did not anticipate in this day and age. In 2016, he, of course, as everybody knows, ran for president under the Democratic ticket. And while he was expected to not do very well, he just wanted to be a voice for progressive causes in a field that everyone knew was going to be dominated by Hillary Clinton. And everybody was, expecting him to do well in the debates, to push Clinton more left. And then, once the actual votes started coming in, it was going to be over. But that's not what happened. At the Iowa caucus, it was down to literal coin tosses to find out who was going to get the delegates. One thing they don't tell you, though, is that, they did 6 coin tosses to decide the really, really close caucus races between Clinton and Sanders, and all 6 of those coin tosses went to Clinton. I just, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but damn. He then proceeded to win in the New Hampshire primary and won a staggering number of primaries. Now, while he was always behind because the structure of the Democratic primaries very much pushed the narratives that all of the most right-wing states in the Democratic caucus went first. So Clinton got a huge lead, and with a superdelegate system, she looked like she was going to be way ahead. And the steam of getting a Sanders nomination started to peter out. He was always a long shot, but it got as close as possible. And so there was just this overwhelming, spark of a dream. For people like me who've been following electoral politics in America for so long and have just seen more and more and more disappointing Democratic candidates, to see somebody who actually had good positions running for president and doing well, it was life-changingly invigorating. Judging how many millennials supported the Sanders campaign and how much energy he had, and after the 2016 election, he was the most liked politician in Congress for, I think he still is a sign that something happened. Something changed because Sanders decided to run for president in 2016. And now Sanders is running for president again in 2020. And this time it seems like it's a campaign whose ideas have finally come to fruition. So many people who are running now who did not support him in the 2016 election all of a sudden have discovered that they support a lot of his positions. And so a lot of them are trying to be Bernie light in a lot of cases, while Bernie is still being Bernie. And now we should go and talk through his platform, his position platform, and there are a lot to get through, so just be patient with me. We've got some stuff. So first, let's talk about the most important election issue, which is climate change. Bernie Sanders takes climate change very seriously. He's one of the biggest proponents for the Green New Deal, which is a way to not only fix the broken energy system that the United States and the world really has, but also to do it in a way that brings employment and economic justice, especially to those who are being hardest hit by the grotesque monster that is capitalism. He also is, as far as I can tell, because Elizabeth Warren recently waffled on it, the only proponent of an actual public healthcare system that is not a public option, that is not a tax incentive, that is not like some weasel way to keep the market around, but a straight up Medicare for all system in which everybody would be plugged into a public healthcare system and it would just take healthcare out of the marketplace. This is an important distinction that makes Sanders different from every other candidate, because a public healthcare system that is taken out of the market would be one of the biggest benefits for the US, not only on a health level, but on an economic level. The general increase in lifespan and, health outcomes is just one thing, but also the fact that the United States pays more money than any other country on earth per capita for medical expenses because of public-private partnerships and the lack of bargaining power because there's not really consolidated healthcare systems shows that this is a weak system, and that a strong public healthcare system would be able to get way better rates, would be way better deals, and would help Americans, because right now in America, healthcare costs are basically the #1 cause of bankruptcy. Aside from wiping out student loans, this would do the most to do admittedly a big fix, but one that would save America a bunch of money, and on top of that also make a lot of Americans' lives tangibly better in a very short term. Sanders also believes, and I am very inclined to agree with him, that college, post-secondary education is no longer a thing that is really optional. It's a thing that really most people need to do in order to have a gainful career. So Sanders is for getting rid of tuition on colleges and allowing people to go to university for free. This would have a huge impact on future generations and current generations. Millennials are in an obscene amount of student debt, something to the tune of like $1 trillion. I really hope that Sanders would wipe out that debt. I didn't see anything in his platform about doing that, but hopefully Elizabeth Warren can poke him in that direction, because I do think that Sanders really needs to get on that. But student debt and the expenses that come with education is one of the main things that hobbles millennials right after they get out of school. And alleviating them of that would, first of all, allow a lot of people who are underprivileged, who do not have the money to go to university, would be able to. And on top of that, when they get out of university, they would be in either no debt or very little debt, which would help out a lot in trying to build new careers and do things like have children and buy houses and all those things that people seem to want millennials to do. They would finally actually start doing. He also wanted to push for a $15 minimum wage, which is just sort of adjusting for inflation. The minimum wage has been stagnant. Wages in general have been stagnant for decades while inflation has gone up, which means people have been effectively taking pay cuts for the last 40 years. This way would at least adjust things slightly, but his goal, as he has said, is to get to a point where everybody who is working a full-time job would be able to afford at least an apartment and, rent and food and all of the basics, which sounds more like a living wage, but I imagine that that is a controversial word that you can't say in American politics. On the note of helping working class families, he's for pre-kindergarten, free pre-kindergarten. He's for a public childcare service, which is a thing that, except for Quebec, no province does in Canada, but would be an amazing thing, because right now for young parents, childcare expenses like babysitting and daycares are like one of the most expensive things that they have to pay for. And having a public system that was cheap, at least, but free would be even better, would help a lot of working class parents be able to raise kids, which is like a thing that no one can afford to do anymore. And when they do have kids, they go into extreme amounts of debt and go into freaking poverty and destitution. This would be go a long way towards solving that. He's made explicit that he also wants to make sure that the pay gap, the gender pay gap, gets closed, or as closed as much as possible. Equal pay for equal work. He's also wanted to push for things like paid family leave, paid medical leave, for paid vacation being guaranteed for every worker. He wants to make it easy for people to join unions. He wants to create green jobs. He wants to make massive employment programs, especially for people who live in rural regions. We'll talk a little bit about that when he gets to Indigenous people. Hey, editing Tristan again. I forgot to talk about this part of Sanders' platform. There was a whole lot of things on my list, and I have very bad handwriting. But basically, Sanders has an entire position centered around Indigenous Americans, which not a lot of Democratic candidates actually do. And his platform revolves around empowering tribal governments and empowering tribes to be able to practice their own cultural ways, but also to help out and bring employment to their communities and help with the really dangerous issue that comes up a lot about Indigenous women getting abused. So, good on you, Sanders. He does want to push for gun control legislation, a bunch of stuff on background checks, a bunch of stuff on making sure that people who are dangerous do not have access to guns, and also about blocking the influence of lobbyist groups like the NRA from, messing with American democracy and, not allowing for extremely popular laws like gun control to happen. He's also got a litany of things he wants to do for criminal justice reform. He wants to legalize weed, which would be a huge boon to not only the American economy, but on top of that, to take people who are completely innocent out of the criminal justice system. No private prisons, ding. No cash bail, ding ding. No death penalty, ding ding ding. No civil asset forfeiture, or at least heavily reformed, ding 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 ding. And no mandatory minimums. Ding, 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 ding. He wants to increase democracy in America by making sure that people who have criminal records are not blocked from voting. He wants to reinstate the Voting Rights Act and enable automatic registration for everyone in America over 18 and making the election a national holiday and getting rid of things like gerrymandering and voter suppression to make sure that the next and future elections would have a more democratic mechanism for choosing new members of Congress. So maybe we wouldn't have a Congress that's full of people that everyone hates. Sanders also has some immigration plans. He wants to have a path to citizenship. He wants to support the Dreamers, all that kind of stuff. All good in my books. He, of course, wants to undo all the horrible things that Trump has done at the border. And one of the things that he did, now this is another sticking point with me, is that he wants to heavily reform and heavily restructure ICE instead of abolishing it like, I would want. But also, he does point out that Sanders voted against ISIS's creation in the first place. So hopefully, turning ICE into something very, very different will at least be a step forward. And he also wants to add more oversight for the Department of Homeland Security, which is another organization that has a lot of criminal overreach in what they do to people. Holy moly, this video is getting long. Sanders, you have so many policies that I want to talk about because these are all actual policies. Like if you go to like the freaking Biden website, there's like 10 paragraphs of like things Biden wants to do, and Sanders is like, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, and this, and this, and this. It's like he's been sitting on a wish list for decades that he's finally able to reveal to the public. When it comes to trade, he's a little bit more protectionist. He wants to make sure that, say, Buy American becomes more of a thing, which, as a Canadian is not super great for me, but, he wants to revitalize America's industrial sector, which is not a bad idea. He also wants to reinvest in public education. This not only involves stopping the privatization of schools, but also heavy reforms to charter schools and making sure that the public schools that do exist are better funded. And yes, he wants to do a complete revamp of charter schools so that they can no longer be exclusive to just the wealthy. On the education side, he also wants to make sure that America's got this problematic system of really high stakes standardized tests, which could have huge impacts on the rest of your life. And because of that, like a lot of teachers' evaluations, a lot of school evaluations, because a lot of students are all based on how well people do on these tests, he wants to revamp that whole system so that teachers are no longer just teaching so that they can pass one test. But on top of that, kids can, find other ways to succeed that doesn't involve just doing well on one freaking test. And, just to put a cherry on the top of his big list of policies, he wants to overthrow the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court, which basically lets corporations donate as much money to politicians as they want. You could just see how the amount spent on elections ballooned after the decision to show why that's important. And, it would go a long way to at least putting a check on the payola system about how wealthy people basically get everything they want done legislation-wise while most people suffer. Whew, that was a nice laundry list of all of the things America should do, isn't it? But let's sit back and discuss a few of these things, because there are some things we are going to need to consider if Sanders is going to be president that we really need to think about. One, these are ideas that are popular with Americans, with people in general, but they're not popular with neither the Republican nor Democratic parties, which means if Sanders is president, he's going to have an uphill battle in Congress. Even if he had a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, the Democrats in general want to protect the privileges of the rich, and there will be a lot of pushback against a lot of these policy decisions. He can't just get AOC to fix everything. So President Sanders is going to need a lot of public push on Congress people after he becomes president to get these things through, lest the neoliberal third-way Democratic Congress block or manipulate the things that Sanders is trying to push as a policy position to the point where they don't actually do anything good for anyone. So even if Sanders wins, it's going to be a contentious presidential career that is going to need a lot of activism on the part of the people in order to force their representatives to do the things that they want rather than the things their rich benefactors want. The other thing that I think is very apparent is that Sanders is very advanced in age. He's a man who is in his 80s. A president in his 80s would make him the oldest person to have ever been elected president, which I don't think we should be ageist and say that that disqualifies him, but it does mean that when he is president, we should have a strong consideration about how he can keep all of this together, and on top of that, to make sure that he has a strong vice presidential candidate in order to make sure that if, something bad happens to him while he's in office, not just dying, but say suffering from a really bad illness, that the vice president will be strong and robust and able to make the policy positions that everybody obviously wants to go through. So the vice presidential pick for Sanders' campaign is going to be extremely, extremely, extremely important. All right, so that's this series. Please, these videos take a lot of work, so please, if you want to support me keeping the series going, keeping Step Back going, patreon.com/stepbackhistory or paypal.me/stepbackhistory. Those are the things that keep me alive. I'm trying to get this to be my full-time career, and I'm so close. So your $1 a month or even like $5 that you just want to throw me on PayPal can go a long way towards helping me on that front. Next time, maybe not next week, but definitely the next time I do this series, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Warren. So hold tight for that one. See ya.
This land was made for you and me.
This land is yours.